Have you ever walked into a room with every right to be there? Every credential, every ounce of authority, every reason to belong, yet been treated like you were invisible? The eyes don't skip over you because your name's missing from the guest list. No, they skip because your skin alone tells them you're the one on the outside. It's not a fleeting humiliation. It's a silent cut, repeated again and again, as if the whole world had conspired to remind you, you're just the assistant. That pain isn't mine alone. I'm Andre Collins. But the pain of every black person who's ever been shoved to the back row, told to wait outside, stared at, but never truly seen. It cuts deep, like something carved into stone where silence stops being peace and turns into shackles. But believe me, there's a fire that rises in moments like this. A fire not just to sit at the table, but to prove no one has the right to decide where you belong. That fire turns every condescending glance into another rung on the ladder, pushing you higher. I carried that fire with me into that gleaming boardroom, the one where everyone assumed I was just some assistant with a notepad. And then, with a single signature, I flipped the entire table. They thought they were negotiating with the real boss somewhere else. Turns out, from the very start, the black man they belittled was the CEO, the only one holding the pen that mattered. 1 second, that's all it took. The whole room froze, and in that silence, the truth got exposed. If you've ever tasted the sting of being underestimated, stay with me. Hit like, share this, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because I promise you'll see a piece of your own story in this takedown. And now let me take you back to that morning. Back to the moment I pushed through the glass doors of Sterling Corporation, where every eye immediately labeled me as the guy carrying someone else's paperwork. I, Andre Collins, stepped into the gleaming glass lobby of Sterling Corporation. The revolving doors swept me into a space so polished that even the overhead lights cut into perfect, cold reflections across the marble floor. Everything here was designed to intimidate, to radiate power. Like even the walls themselves whispered, only those who belong get to stand here. At the center of the lobby sat a long, walnut reception desk. Behind it was Rachel, a young woman with a half smile and eyes carrying layers of prejudice wrapped neatly in corporate courtesy. That first glance lasted no more than 3 seconds, but I could feel it tracing me. Down from the lapel of my tailored suit to my shoes, then back up to my skin. She didn't need to say a word. Her eyes had already spoken. He doesn't belong here. Belong. I walked toward the desk slowly, each step echoing through the lobby like a drumbeat against the invisible gates this world has always tried to keep in place for men like me. I've been stopped at plenty of doors before, the velvet ropes of high-end restaurants, the polished glass of executive boardrooms, even the narrow aisles of first-class cabins. And each time I learned something. Doors eventually open. If you stand there long enough with the right reason to enter. Rachel tilted her head, her voice soft as silk, sharp as a blade. Sir, may I help you? The boardroom on the 27th floor is reserved for executives and senior partners. Assistants may wait in the lounge area over there. The words were arranged politely, but the arrow flew straight and true. In under 3 seconds, she had demoted me from invited guest to assistant on skin color alone, on the lazy arrogance of assumption masquerading as fact. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I slowly removed my gloves, opened my leather briefcase, and placed the Sterling Corporation invitation on the desk. The paper made a faint rustle, but in that polished silence, it landed like a lit match on dry wood. Rachel raised one brow, 1 second, 2, and then the half-smile returned, polite to the point of cruelty. Oh, an invitation, of course. I'll double-check the list. I looked her straight in the eye. No anger. No need to justify myself. Because I knew scenes like this were always a test. The question was never whether my paperwork was valid. The question was how many times I'd let them define me before flipping the table over. As Rachel reached for the letter, I noticed security guards glancing in my direction. The look was familiar, collective. A silent consensus that my presence here was a glitch in the building's perfection. And in that moment, I smiled to myself. Because I knew every dismissive glance was just another member of the audience for a show they didn't yet know they were about to see. Rachel set the invitation back down as if it were a flyer handed out on a street corner. Her lips curved into that same too polite smile, and she repeated, "The 27th floor is reserved for executives and senior partners. Assistants may wait in the lounge." This time she put just enough weight on the word assistant to let me know that no matter what papers I carried, she had already placed me in the shadows of someone else's importance. A few people in the waiting area looked up. I could see it in their eyes, the faint spark of amusement people get when they smell humiliation in the air. Next to me, a man in a gray suit chuckled under his breath. Another one thinking he belongs here. He didn't say it loudly, just enough for me to hear. Just enough for everyone else to share the joke. A joke in which I was the unwitting punchline. I stood there, one hand on my briefcase, eyes forward. I've met this kind of gatekeeper before. The ones whose power lives in magnetic keycards, security lists, and elevator access. For them, control doesn't live in contracts or board votes. It lives in the privilege of telling someone else to stay put. I didn't argue, didn't sigh, just watched. Because I knew the longer they spoke, the deeper they dug the hole they were standing in. "Is there a problem with my invitation?" I asked finally, my voice calm, even. Rachel flicked her eyes down at the letter, then back at me, then toward the elevators where other executives were stepping in. She was stalling. She wanted everyone to see her holding the gate while I waited outside it. The man in the gray suit added smoothly, "You know, sometimes junior staff dream of setting foot in the big rooms. Best to keep those dreams private, though." The words slid out sweet as honey, hiding the sting of a knife. I tilted my head slightly and smiled, not at him, but at the memory I was filing away. Because the sharpest weapon in moments like this isn't rage, it's a cold, precise memory. Around the lobby, curious eyes started collecting. Someone pretended to scroll through their phone, but was clearly listening. Someone else folded their newspaper slowly, ears open. I could feel the scene turning into a spectacle. And like any good audience, they didn't yet know the ending they were about to witness. I didn't move, didn't retreat, just stood there, letting the silence spread until even the faint tapping of keyboards across the room felt loud. Rachel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Maybe she was used to people shrinking back. But this time, the script wasn't going the way she expected. Inside, a thought flickered. Let them build the wall higher, the fall will only be louder. I slowly pulled another envelope from my case, this one embossed, heavy paper, Sterling's gold crest, stamped under the lobby's cold lights. I set it down softly, no flourish, no aggression. Just a single sheet making a single sharp sound on the desk. "Maybe you should check the list again," I said quietly. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't need to. In a room this tense, calm words land the heaviest. Rachel paused. The fake warmth in her face cracked for half a heartbeat. But instead of admitting she'd misjudged, she lifted the phone and began dialing. Like a conductor waving her baton, convinced she still held control of the orchestra, even as the music was slipping away from her. The man in the gray suit smirked. "Ah, an invitation. Maybe for the catering team, huh?" The cheap laughter from the seats nearby followed. How quickly people flocked to the scent of someone else's humiliation. I didn't rise to it. Didn't give the performance they wanted. I just met Rachel's eyes and waited. And in that waiting, she blinked first. Because silence, when held long enough, turns from weakness into defiance. She made the call. She was hoping I knew for confirmation that I didn't belong. That security would escort me out, tidy and quiet, a footnote to their afternoon. But I stood there calm, almost amused. Because the irony was this: the more they tried to keep me out, the harder the impact when I sat at the head of the table. I checked the clock on the wall. The second hand ticked forward, steady, patient. Let them think they hold the power, I thought. In a few minutes, the story flips. And when the elevator doors finally opened to carry me to the 27th floor, I smiled faintly. Because I knew what waited behind those doors, more eyes ready to underestimate me, more walls to break. And the higher the floor, the louder the crash when it all came down. The elevator opened with a familiar ding, a sound that usually meant nothing, but in that moment felt like a drumbeat signaling the start of a fight. I stepped into the gleaming cabin, 4 mirrored steel walls reflecting everything. My face, my straight-back stance, the heavy silence of the confined space. A second later, 3 men entered. All in gray suits, dark ties, the cloying scent of expensive cologne trailing behind them like a claim of territory. In the middle was Jonathan Hale, Sterling's chief financial officer, a man famous for smirking even during handshakes. His eyes flicked over me for half a second, then moved on as if I were part of the wallpaper. The doors slid shut. The space shrank instantly. Numbers on the display jumped from 5 to 6 to 7. I stood still, one hand on my briefcase, gaze forward, unflinching. But silence, I've learned, always invites the first insult. Jonathan adjusted his tie, leaned toward his companions, voice low but pitched just enough for me to hear. Interesting, these days even assistants wear tailored suits. Probably has to drop it off at a laundromat tonight, though. All 3 laughed. The sound hit the steel walls, bounced back, doubled in bitterness. They wanted me to hear. That was the point. In a sealed box like this, there was no escape from humiliation. They wanted the elevator itself to join in, to turn their laughter into a chorus saying, I didn't belong on the top floor. I tilted my head slightly, caught my reflection in the steel. My own face stared back, calm, unshaken, and in my mind, a wry thought surfaced. Funny how men obsessed with power always pick the smallest rooms to display it. 4 walls, 1 elevator, and they thought they owned the whole building. The numbers climbed, 12, 13. Jonathan kept going, carving his jokes like initials into a park bench. Probably his boss is stuck in the parking garage somewhere, so they sent the assistant up first. This time I smiled. Not at them, at myself. Because every cheap jab they threw was just paving stones for the reversal waiting upstairs. I didn't need to respond. Let them believe the script was theirs. I was only here to deliver the twist. The elevator stopped on 20. 1 man stepped out. The doors closed again. I pressed the button for 27, the top floor. And that's when all 3 pairs of eyes turned to the panel. A flicker of surprise, a hairline crack in their confidence. Their laughter hiccuped. Because the 27th floor wasn't where assistants went. I stood straight watching the numbers climb. 21, 22, every floor ringing like a bell announcing their mistake. Jonathan leaned in again, voice carrying a little too clearly now. Assistant in a custom suit probably skips lunch for a month to pay for it. The joke was for the room, not for me. He wanted the steel walls to echo it back, to make it bigger than it was. And the laughter came right on cue, bouncing around the cabin like coins dropped in an empty jar. I kept my eyes on the numbers overhead. 15, 16. Let them laugh. Because in a place this small, their voices were recording themselves onto memory, word for word. Jonathan wasn't done. He had the energy of a bad actor given his first microphone. Bet when we get to 27, his boss will tip him for waiting outside so politely. The laughter rose again. 1 man checked his watch, smirking, like they were all in on some grand joke. That was when I laughed. Just a quiet, thin curve of my lips, enough for them to notice. It stopped them cold for half a second. Because men like this only enjoy the punchline when it lands on someone cringing. They didn't know what to do with someone smiling back at them. And inside I thought, if the height of your authority lives inside 4 metal walls, then your power is nothing but rust dressed as silver. The numbers lit up 20, then 21. Another passenger stepped in, heard the laughter, kept his eyes on the floor. The oldest trick in the book, if you don't look, you don't have to choose a side. That's how cruelty survives. Not through the loud, but through the silent. Jonathan caught my gaze in the mirrored wall. A flicker. He hid it quickly behind a shrug, turning back to his companions. But I'd seen it, the tiny glint of unease. Because I wasn't slouching, I wasn't shrinking. I stood like a man not waiting for permission. 22. 23. The jokes thinned out. Even they could feel it now, that they were talking too much, laughing too loud, in a room that no longer laughed with them. I said nothing. Because sometimes the cleanest way to expose arrogance is to let it echo until it trips over itself. Then came the ding. 27 lit up bright and final. The doors opened. I walked out. Slow, steady steps across polished marble, leaving behind 3 men in a small, overheated box where their jokes still clung to the walls like smoke after a cheap fireworks show. Not a word from me. I didn't need one. The silence was heavier than any comeback, because now they had to sit with the question they didn't dare speak. If he's just an assistant, why is he walking into the top floor? And as the doors closed behind me, I knew this was just the opening act. The real performance waited inside the boardroom. The boardroom doors swung open, and I stepped in as if onto a stage built for roles I was never supposed to play. The air here was different from the elevator. If the elevator was tight and suffocating with cheap laughter, this room was vast and swollen with curated silence. A long dark wood table ran wall to wall. Black leather chairs sat in perfect rows, each one like a miniature throne for people who think power can be measured by how soft the upholstery is. Light poured down and bounced off the table until I could see my reflection. One solitary figure etched into the hard lines of the architecture. In front, a bright projector churned out numbers and charts, the private language of the room. I didn't hesitate. I chose a seat near the center, where decisions actually get made, where every eye naturally turns. I pulled out a leather chair and sat with calm, as if the seat had always had my name on it. The atmosphere shifted instantly. A chair across from me scraped. A breath caught. Eyes slid my way. I didn't need to look to know what they were thinking. Who is he, and why does an assistant have the nerve to sit dead center? In the corner, a server paused mid-pour. He wasn't shocked by me so much as by what I represented. Seats like this were reserved for names spoken loudly and applauded. A black man sitting there, quiet and unbothered, was not in the script. I let my gaze drift around the room. Abstract art on the walls, the kind bought to signal that everything here sits just beyond the reach of those who don't belong. I stayed still, back straight, palms on the polished wood. Not to provoke, just because I knew that my being here was provocation enough. I thought of all the other times. Smaller conference rooms, hotel suites, first-class cabins. How many times had I been asked to move, to make room for someone more appropriate? How many times had a chair become a wall? Maybe that's why sitting down today carried its own weight. I didn't bang the table. I didn't make a speech. I just sat in the right place and let the silence do the rest. Sometimes silence stirs more than applause ever could. I hadn't even touched the water when a thin, sharp voice sliced the air. "You're in the wrong seat. That's for the boss, not an assistant." Martin Green, one of Sterling's lead partners. Face like carved stone, forehead lined with the habits of a man who's used to giving orders. His eyes narrowed, taking me in like an intruder in his private territory. Laughter popped from both sides of the table. Not the easy kind, more like a pact, a little accelerant on the flame of humiliation. Someone leaned back, hands behind his head, settling in for the morning's entertainment. Another murmured, "An assistant taking the center chair. Now, that's funny." The room, calm a moment before, turned noisy with scattered laughs and whispers. Each chuckle, a small stone thrown my way, not enough to knock me down, but stacking into a wall meant to push me back from the seat. I stayed put. Back to leather, eyes on Martin. The crease in his brow wasn't about a stolen chair. It was rage that the usual order had slipped. In his mind, a black man stands behind the chair, hands over the deck, nods at the right times. The center seat? No. That threatened the scaffolding he and the others cling to feel tall. And inside their smugness, I caught something fragile. They needed me to stand. They needed to see me accept that I'd sat where I don't belong. Only then would their balance be restored. I smiled, thin, enough to make a few gazes wobble. The room split into two forces, their nervous laughter trying to assert control, and my quiet refusal. It was the quiet that made them fidget. Because here's the simple truth. If I were just an assistant, I would have stood up already. Martin cleared his throat, trying to salvage authority. "Did you not hear me? That seat isn't for you." I didn't move. And in that stretched out beat, I could hear the room's heartbeat pick up, people realizing the script wasn't going to plan. I looked Martin in the eye. No speech, just a look that said, "This isn't your joke anymore. This is a test. And you are the ones being graded." Then I said evenly, almost like an aside, "I'm fine here. Chairs don't choose people." A strange hush fell. Laughter, mid-stride, sputtered and died, like a candle snuffed by a draft. Faces that expected a flustered apology stalled instead. What they saw was a man sitting straight, offering a line that hung over the table like a placard. Who's really in the wrong seat here? I lifted the water glass and took a slow sip. A small gesture, but I knew it landed. The kind of calm that tells a room you have no intention of moving. The chair, to me, wasn't decor, it was a statement. Chairs don't choose people. The refrain echoed in my head. For years, the world has tried to teach the opposite, that men like me belong on the edge of the table or behind a closed door. But a chair has never determined a person's worth. People determine the worth of the chair, and today that reversal was happening right here in a room built to exclude me. Martin started to speak again, then stopped. I watched the tug-of-war in his face press down on me with fake authority or keep a shred of dignity in front of the other partners. He chose silence, but it didn't carry power anymore. It only exposed the failure of the little humiliation routine. The temperature shifted. The laughter was gone. In its place, caution. They began to study me, not with smirks, but with a calculation. Instinct told them I wasn't an assistant. And if they guessed wrong, that there'd be a price. I leaned back slightly, still smiling. That same thin, amused line. I didn't explain. Explanations belong to people making excuses. I had none to make. By the time their eyes stopped searching for cues, I knew the match had begun. What they thought was just a seating mistake was about to become the nightmare of a much bigger misread. Seated to my right was Daniel Wright, the man I had once trusted enough to hand over sensitive contracts on business trips. He had been the quiet support, always one step behind me, ready to slide a document forward at the exact moment, answering questions in clipped tones so I didn't have to waste words. I remembered the long trips, the layovers in foreign airports, the way he managed schedules and handled last-minute calls. I remembered him waiting outside hotel ballrooms while I gave speeches, coat in hand, ready the second I stepped off stage. To me, Daniel had always defined what a teammate should be. Not flashy, not loud, but dependable. So when I sat in that boardroom this morning, I had no reason to doubt him. In a space thick with judgmental eyes, his presence was supposed to remind me I wasn't alone, that there was someone here who had witnessed enough to vouch for me if anyone tried to twist the truth. I glanced his way. He gave me that faint smile I knew so well, a silent agreement we'd always shared. The smile that said, "We've been through worse, we're fine." But there was something else flickering behind his eyes. Not confidence, not solidarity, something calculated. The look of a man who'd already decided on a new move, a move I hadn't realized involved me. Because in that polished room, with its leather chairs and the last traces of laughter still fading, I began to sense a second kind of silence. Not the one I had created, but the tense, expectant hush of people waiting for a cue. Their eyes flicked from me to Daniel, as if they already knew he was about to tip the balance. I stayed calm, but a quiet warning stirred inside me. If decades in business had taught me anything, it was this. The deepest cuts always come from the people standing closest. Strangers can humiliate you, yes, but only allies get the chance to betray you. I told myself, don't mistake familiarity for loyalty. Sometimes familiarity is just the thickest mask. Daniel straightened in his chair, arms folded across his chest, a little too at ease. I heard the faint squeak of leather as he leaned forward, like a man about to try on a role he hadn't played before. Then he stood. The chair groaned behind him, a dry, sharp sound no one else noticed, but to me it was a warning bell. He smiled awkwardly, his lips pulling tight in a way I didn't recognize, though the men across the table welcomed it like a gift. "He's just the assistant," Daniel said lightly. "The real executive will be here soon. Don't worry, gentlemen." The words hit the table like a hammer. And for a split second, I didn't just hear them. I felt them run cold and electric down my spine. The man who had waited with me in airports, carried my briefcase into boardrooms, handed me contracts at just the right moment, had just shoved me off the edge in front of the entire room. Laughter broke out in small, eager bursts. One director slapped the table, grinning. Knew it. Could tell the second he sat down. Morning comedy show right here. Another shook his head, mock pity curling his mouth, enjoying every second of public humiliation. Daniel kept standing there, smiling that strained smile. But now it wasn't just awkward. It was a mask. The mask of a man who'd picked his side. His hand rested on the back of the chair, leaning toward the partners like a man auditioning for a seat among them. For a moment, I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. A different kind of silence. Not the silence I wielded like a weapon, but the hollow stillness of an unexpected wound. The kind that doesn't hurt because the blade was sharp, but because of the hand that held it. I looked at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. But I knew what he was telling himself, that this betrayal was strategic, that stepping away from me would win him a place with them. He thought this was an exit ramp. To me, it was just a cheap performance, a man mistaking treachery for ambition. Around the table, they leaned toward him, nodding, validating him with the smugness of men who believed their prejudice had just been confirmed. Someone even clapped him on the shoulder when he sat back down, a reward for a well-timed betrayal. I stayed still, hands folded on the cold table. Not a word to defend myself, because I knew defense only feeds the lie. Let them have their moment. Let Daniel enjoy the applause. Because betrayal always tastes sweet for about 5 minutes. After that, the bitterness sets in, and it doesn't leave. I gave them nothing. No denial, no protest. They wanted me rattled. I left them empty. Daniel thought he'd bought himself credibility by disowning the man who brought him into this room. He mistook silence for surrender. One of the partners gestured toward me with his chin, voice dripping mock sympathy. Quiet one, isn't he? Guess that's what assistants do best. Nod, take notes, stay out of the way. The table erupted again. Daniel laughed too. I watched the hesitation in his grin, the way his mouth didn't quite fit the part yet. Because that's the curse of betrayal. They think they're breaking free, when all they've done is swap one chain for another. I lifted my water glass and drank slowly. The clink when I set it down was sharp, deliberate, a full stop in the middle of their chorus. A few heads turned. My calm didn't match the caricature they were trying to paint. I said nothing. No need to expose him. Not yet. The timing wasn't right. High stakes require patience. And silence, when stretched long enough, makes the fall hit harder. Inwardly, I almost laughed. After all these years, they still hadn't learned. The silence of a black man in a room full of prejudice isn't submission. It's the drum roll before the storm. I sat there, motionless. And with each passing second, the weight of my silence grew, heavy enough that even they would start to feel it. They didn't know it yet. But I was already setting the trap. And when I finally spoke, the same silence they were mocking would turn on them and cut deeper than any blade. The sound hit first, a heavy thud as a thick stack of contracts landed on the polished wood, sending a faint tremor across the glossy surface. Pages upon pages, corners gilded in gold, carrying the faint scent of fresh ink, as if designed less to be read than to impress. Martin Green leaned back, lips curling into that sweet, sugar-coated smile that always carried the aftertaste of mockery. His voice came smooth, deliberate, dressed up like courtesy but reeking of condescension. We'll let your executive review these carefully. Assistants usually don't need to worry about the fine print. Laughter rippled softly around the table, practiced and synchronized like a choir that knew its cue. They didn't even look at me when they laughed. Their eyes stayed on each other, as though I were just the empty space between them, a silent backdrop for their performance. I lowered my gaze to the stack. Each page looked like a brick in a white wall, trying to fence me out from the truth buried inside. Clauses ran dense and complicated, jargon stacked on jargon. The preferred weapons of men who believe language itself can be turned into shackles for the unworthy. I reached out, fingertips grazing the first page. Just that simple gesture, and I caught Martin watching me from the corner of his eye, his smirk deepening. He was thinking, look at him, pretending to read, as if he understands any of this. Across the table, men leaned toward one another, trading glances, drumming their fingers on the wood in a slow, expectant rhythm. They were waiting for it, the hesitation, the question, the little flicker of uncertainty they thought would expose me as out of my depth. But I stayed upright, calm, turning another page, then another. Slowly, deliberately. Each sheet whispered as I flipped it, the dry rasp of paper somehow louder in that tense, airless room. I didn't need to speak. The sound alone was enough to chip away at their confidence. And then I saw it. Nestled deep in the middle of the legal maze, wrapped in polished language slick as oil, was the trap. A single clause buried under numbers and promises, one that looked harmless at a glance, but if signed, it would strip the other party of nearly all control for years to come, locking power squarely into Sterling's grip. A velvet noose hidden in the fine print. I'd seen this trick too many times before, and men like Martin always assumed the same thing, that whoever sat in the lesser chair would never be sharp enough to catch it. I looked up briefly, eyes flicking across Martin's face before dropping back to the page. Then, without a word, I tapped my pen 3 times against the table. Just 3 soft knocks, but enough to make a few people glance my way. I said nothing. Because sometimes silence doesn't just hold secrets, it holds a mirror. I turned another page. My pen rested idly in my fingers, spinning slow circles against the wood. Around the table, they shifted in their seats. My composure didn't fit the picture they were painting. And beneath that picture, I could see the real game. Martin and Jonathan, sharing those little nods of men who think they're the smartest in the room. Daniel beside me, tight-lipped, pretending neutrality, but silently relieved he'd chosen their side. He thought he'd crossed into safety. He didn't know yet. He was just another pawn on their board. I kept reading, slowly, letting them believe what they wanted. Because the longer you pull a string tight, the harder it snaps back. Finally, I closed the folder, laid the pen down gently on top, said nothing. And the room exhaled. Chairs shifted, shoulders relaxed. Martin leaned back, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. Jonathan smirked across at him, the kind of smirk men wear when they think the hunt is already over. Someone muttered under his breath, "Easier than I expected." They thought I'd missed it, thought I was just the fool in the center seat playing executive for a day. Even Daniel let out the smallest sigh, the sound of a man who thinks he's picked the winning side. I let them have it. Their smiles, their nods, their little glances at each other as though the room itself had tilted in their favor. Because they didn't realize the truth. The trap they thought I'd stepped into? I was already holding the rope. And outside this boardroom, the real stage was just beginning to take shape. The wall clock clicked in dry, deliberate beats, as if determined to underline how slowly time was moving. Each tick didn't just mark a second passing, it drove the needle a little deeper into the room's restlessness. No one would admit it, but everyone at the table was trapped in the same strange anticipation, waiting for the man they believed would walk in and free them all. Jonathan Hale, never one to let silence breathe, murmured just loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Your boss is late, huh? We shouldn't be kept waiting like this." It sounded like a gentle scold, but the velvet wrapped a blade. In one sentence, he affirmed the absence of the real executive and boxed me back into the role of a seat warmer. A couple of men gave soft laughs, the kind people make when they think they're watching a comedy, and I'm just the temporary clown. Every glance drifted to the door. Each time footsteps echoed down the hall, bodies tensed in unison, ready for the dramatic entrance. And each time, just a server passing by or a janitor pushing a cart, the room then exhaled its disappointment, disguising it as patient sighs. Martin Green rolled a pen between his fingers, eyes flicking from me back to the door like I was a misplaced paperweight. He tilted his head and said, mild and cutting all at once, "Maybe his boss is in a real meeting. Makes sense. Big work can't be left to an assistant." The air dipped, then filled with chatter again, little waves smacking ashore. They traded theories about the real boss. Maybe he was with the board, maybe coming from a more important appointment. No one asked me anything. They spoke around me as if I didn't exist. I sat straight, eyes on the mirror-bright table. Every time they laughed, I took a small sip of water, calm to the point of irritation. I could feel their impatience spreading. They needed my boss to appear, to validate the sneers, to restore order to the chair I was in. but his continued absence made them more anxious. With each minute, a new hairline crack formed in their sense of control. Because in the backs of their eyes, I saw the question forming. If he's really just an assistant, why is he still sitting there, unbothered? I said nothing. I let the clock click. I let the whispers pile up. I let waiting become a gentle kind of torture. That's when I knew. The trap wasn't only in the contract, but the trap was in the bonnets. A silver-haired director at the far end squinted and smirked. Perhaps his actual boss is busy signing bigger deals. Let the assistant entertain us in the meantime. The line fell like acid, spreading thinly across the long table. Laughter burst, cold, throat-deep, never reaching the eyes. It sliced, sharp and thin, leaving no visible mark, but it burned. That laughter wasn't just for me. It was a ritual, a way to redraw the line. We are the ones in power. He is the stray joke. Jonathan leaned in, wearing friendliness like a thorned crown. It's fine, sometimes every room needs an audience. Maybe our assistant here will learn something new today. Another round of chuckles ricocheted off the glass walls, turning the bright boardroom into a shining cage. Faces synced to the same rhythm, quirked lips, smug nods, convinced the bit was going beautifully. Daniel, right beside me, forced a smile to match. It didn't quite land, but it said what he wanted it to. I'm with them. I didn't look his way. Let him enjoy the sweet illusion that Betrayal had bought him a ticket to the banquet. In my head, the thought came dry and amused. They call me the audience, without realizing they're staging the worst play right in front of me. And the real audience, outside these walls, won't laugh with them. They'll laugh at them. Another executive twirled his glass and added, wouldn't be surprised if his boss never shows. Probably haggling somewhere that matters. Meanwhile, we just keep wasting our time. Their laughter swallowed even the clock. And in the middle of it, I sat still. I rolled my pen between my fingers without meeting a single gaze. To them, it was a nervous tick. In truth, it was a metronome. I was counting down. The longer they waited, the larger their confidence swelled. They thought they were shredding my dignity with each little jab. I knew better. Their glee was evidence. When the curtain dropped, the echo would come back on them. I took another sip, set the glass down softly, so softly it somehow cut through their noise. A few heads turned without meaning to, and I understood. In trying to make me the joke, they'd handed me the focus. I rested the pen on the contract and began to spin it again. No words, no glance at the door like they kept doing. Just the pen, catching the ceiling lights, drawing small rings of reflection on its barrel. At first, no one noticed. Just an assistant's fidget, they thought. But the sound, the faint tap of metal kissing wood, steady and slow, started occupying space between the laughs. Silence pried their nerves open. Martin drummed his fingers, trying to drown the pen out. Jonathan shot me a quick look, half disdain, half doubt. Someone crossed a leg and the heel began tapping the floor. The room turned into an off-key orchestra, each man making a tiny sound to escape the fact that control had slipped. I didn't look up. I let them watch me without giving them a cue. In their eyes, I was still the assistant, and somehow that very silence had their hearts keeping time with the clock. Daniel coughed, a brittle attempt to puncture the air. It fell flat, vanishing like a raindrop into sand. He glanced at me, fishing for solidarity. I gave none. Sometimes studied indifference is the cleanest way to expose a betrayer. I rolled the pen once more, set it at the contract's edge, lifted it again, repeating the motion, slow and sure, like a pendulum. Faces tightened. The loudest laughers went quiet. Fingers started tapping in sync with my pace, unconsciously pulled into the rhythm I set. Inside, I smiled. They thought I was powerless. I was turning their waiting into rope. The longer they waited, the more their seams showed. The quieter I got, the more their nerves frayed. Finally, one director leaned toward a colleague and hissed, "How much longer? How much time are we wasting on this?" He wasn't asking me, but he might as well have admitted what the whole room felt. They were wobbling. They hadn't noticed how foolish it looked to sit waiting for a man who didn't exist, while the person they needed sat right in front of them. I lifted my eyes and made a single, unhurried sweep of the room. Didn't speak. Just looked. That was enough to make a few heads drop to their papers, pretending to read. My silence, useless a few minutes ago, had become a blade, shaving away their performance. One last turn of the pen, then I stopped. The room froze. They didn't know it yet, but the moment I opened my mouth, I wouldn't just answer their question. I'd erase the fantasy of the boss they were waiting for. The air in the room swelled like a balloon stretched to its limit, one touch away from bursting. Every pair of eyes clung to the door, waiting for it to swing open. But the door stayed shut, cold, deliberate, exposing their hope as the hollow thing it was. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Each beat a reminder that time belongs to no one but the man patient enough to sit still. I felt every breath in the room, heavy, uneven, laced with a suspicion no one dared to name. Martin Green adjusted his tie, trying for composure, but his hand trembled when he set down his pen. Jonathan Hale stared at the door, then at me, then back at the door. His eyes said it all. He wanted me gone from this seat before reality betrayed his prejudice. But the door didn't open. No footsteps came down the hall, and it was just me, sitting there in the center seat, slowly spinning a pen. The silence grew too long. The men who'd been laughing now had nothing left to laugh about. A few shuffled their papers, others bowed over their phones, pretending to be busy. But every face shared the same tell: impatience. And in this room, the impatience wasn't about a late meeting. It was about the crumbling certainty of what they thought they knew. I watched, said nothing. Every second, the silence I made spread like dust across the table, weighing everything down. I knew exactly what they were thinking. If he really is just an assistant, why isn't he nervous? Daniel shifted beside me. I felt the tension crawling up his shoulders. He had chosen his side, risked betrayal to be accepted by theirs. But as the door stayed shut, that choice started cracking. He stared down at the table, lips pressed tight, avoiding my eyes. No one admitted it, but the room had gone quiet in a new way. A silence made of fear. Fear that their entire little comedy might not have a boss walking in to stamp it as truth. Fear that every smirk, every sneer was about to be turned back on them. I set the pen down, stopped spinning it. The soft clink of metal on wood hit the room like a dropped pin in a cathedral. Heads jerked toward me, faces twitching as if the sound had split their masks open. My hand rested on the contract. I didn't speak, but I felt it clearly. The balance had shifted. The same men who smirked when they called me assistant now sat frozen, waiting for something they weren't ready to face. I lowered the pen to the final page. One clean stroke of ink sliced across the paper. The sound ripped through the air, sharp, decisive, ending something none of them could name. The table stilled. Martin Green, who had been feigning concentration on his notes, snapped his head up, eyes wide. Jonathan Hale's mouth opened, but nothing came out. That single stroke of the pen had closed the play they thought they were directing. I leaned back, set the pen on the table, let the signature gleam under the lights. No speech, no request for permission. I signed as if it were the most natural thing in the world, because it was. Silence pooled thick enough to cut. I heard breathing tighten. A chair creaked as someone shifted. Eyes flicked between me, the contract, the ink. No one spoke, but the question blazed in every look. Why did he sign? And who the hell is he? Martin cracked first, voice dry, stripped of its earlier polish. What did you just do? I met his eyes, calm. Finished what needed finishing. Jonathan scrambled through his copy, flipping pages like he might find a trapdoor to undo what was already done. But the signature stayed there, black and final, carved into the page like a verdict. Daniel sat rigid beside me, his breath heavier now. His betrayal, so confident moments ago, shriveled in the spotlight. He'd stood up, declared me an assistant. What kind of assistant signs contracts at the head of the table? Even he could see it now. He'd bet on the wrong side. The room stayed locked in that frozen beat, staring at me, at the ink, at the pen that still lay warm from my hand. They didn't dare speak the truth circling their throats, because speaking it would mean admitting every laugh, every dig had just boomeranged back to cut them open. The thought came bitter and dry. They'd spent the whole morning waiting for a boss to walk in. But he'd been here the whole time, in the very chair they tried to keep me from. I didn't add a word. Silence would do the work for me. And in that silence, the signature thundered louder than any voice. Eyes widened, one after another, as the floor shifted under them. Jonathan Hale, the man always so smooth, so untouchable, finally stammered, voice scraping low. Who are you?" The question stumbled out like a chair leg dragging across stone. Harsh, graceless, exposed. Every face turned toward me, parched for an answer. I looked up, voice steady, weighty enough to pin the room to its chairs. Andre Collins, CEO, Collins Global. Nothing more, but the room cracked open on impact. The clock kept ticking, each beat now hammering shame into the men around the table. Martin Green's mouth sagged, his smirk erased, his skin gone pale. The man who had called me assistant sat shrinking inside his own suit. Jonathan rifled through the contract again like he might wake up from it, but the seal and signature just glared back. Final, binding, undeniable. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. The man who had stood and sold me out couldn't meet my eyes now, and when he finally did, there was no defiance left, only the stunned, silent face of someone realizing he'd built his future on sand. No one laughed. Not one man. The room where they'd mocked me was now a tomb where even their own pride couldn't breathe. Not the silence of scorn this time. The silence of men watching the walls of their own arrogance fall in on them. I didn't have to lecture them, didn't have to raise my voice. The truth had done it for me. The boss they waited for never came. Because he'd never needed to. I saw ties loosen, hands twitch, chairs inch back as though distance could change what they'd done. They avoided my eyes, but it was too late. I'd already seen everything. The collapse of their smug certainty, the shattering of a story they thought they owned. And the bitterest part? A whole morning building walls of prejudice undone by one signature. I sat still, letting the cracks spiderweb through the room. But it wasn't over, not yet, because the final act was coming. The moment they'd have to sign their names right under mine and stamp their own defeat into the record. The room was crowded, but the air was thick as a walk-in freezer. The people who'd been laughing a minute ago now sat mute. Wax figures dropped in the wrong place. I could hear the heavy breathing, the sound of a whole room realizing at once there was nowhere left to hide. Martin Green, the one who'd sneered at me as the assistant, held a glass, his hand shaking. Water lapped over the rim, dribbling onto the table, leaving a cold stain. He set the glass down too fast. The loud clack rang out like an involuntary confession. His face had gone pale. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The triumphant smirk from earlier was gone without a trace. Jonathan Hale didn't look any better. He kept his spine straight, but his fist was clenched under the table, knuckles going green-white. The man who joked so heartily about assistants in tailored suits couldn't find his voice. He glanced at the door one more time, still nursing the fantasy that someone might walk in and save his pride. The door stayed shut, quiet as the truth they'd just had thrown in their faces. Daniel, right beside me, sat rigid. Sweat beaded along his temple. His eyes kept dropping to the contract, then to his hands, then away. He didn't have the nerve to look at me. The man who'd publicly called me assistant now looked like someone who'd locked himself inside the pit of his own betrayal. He knew exactly what it meant. The betrayal didn't buy him admission. It turned him into a living exhibit for a bitter joke. No one spoke. The wall clock hit its marks louder than before, like a small gavel punctuating the verdict. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each beat carved the fact deeper. The mockers had made themselves the losers. I sat still, eyes passing over each face. I didn't need to speak to hear the questions hammering in their heads. Why were we so quick to humiliate him? Why did we choose our prejudice over the reality in front of us? They wouldn't say it aloud. Saying it would mean admitting their swagger was just a hollow shell. A dry thought crossed my mind. Minutes ago, they fancied themselves conductors, controlling every sound in the room. Now the whole orchestra sat silent, and the silence was the clearest score of their weakness. I laced my fingers, the pen resting quiet in my palm. No more spinning. I didn't need another gesture. The truth had done its job, and this silence, the silence of the losing side, was the overture to the end. I straightened, hands flat on the glossy, cold table. The remaining eyes pinned to me flickered like candles about to go out. I drew a slow breath and said, even and resonant as a bell on marble, "You just signed with me, and from this moment on, the rules have changed." That was all, nothing else required. The weight of that short sentence rolled out until no one dared break it. Martin's eyelids fluttered, each blink a useless attempt to wake up from the nightmare. Jonathan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, no sound. He squeezed his pen so hard the tip snapped, ink bleeding into a small blot, an ugly little emblem of helplessness. Daniel had gone chalk white. He parted his lips to speak, then shut them, understanding that any excuse now would only illuminate his betrayal. The fear in his eyes wasn't of me, it was of his own choice. No one answered. No laughter, no rebuttal, only the clock's metronome, a soundtrack for the sentence just handed down. And that sentence came from me, the man they'd called assistant. I let the silence keep working. After a declaration, silence hits harder than 1,000 shouts. It forces a man to look at the truth he'd rather bury. Their whole order collapsed in a single line. I tipped the contract toward them and tapped my signature. 3 dry knocks like 3 strikes of a hammer. No explanations, no proofs. The ink did all the talking. I wasn't just in the right chair. I was the only one with the right to keep it. Martin tried to laugh, but the sound broke, falling flat in the frozen room. He knew, and so did everyone else, that the game had flipped. And the trump card wasn't in their hands, it was in mine. A wry thought flickered. They spent all morning staging a con. I needed one sentence to drop the curtain. I slid my chair back, opening space at the table. A small move, but it spiked the panic in their eyes. They understood the meeting wasn't about negotiation anymore. It was about surviving a match they'd lost on the first move. No one argued, no polite applause. Just silence. So dense you could almost touch it. It hung over every head like a dark scrim, forcing each face to look at itself. I scanned the table. The mockers now sat stiff, avoiding my gaze like it might drag them out of their last hiding place. Martin pressed his lips together, hand fixed on his glass, but too afraid to lift it. Jonathan bit his lip and ducked into the paperwork, pretending to reread lines he knew no longer mattered. Daniel, right beside me, stared at his lap, shoulders caved. He wasn't a teammate anymore, and he wasn't a winner either. Just a shadow in the wrong chair, turned by his own decision into a case study in how fast betrayal collects its debt. I didn't say a word to him. I didn't need to. The silence already had. A thin smile touched my mouth. Not a victor's grin, but the look of someone watching truth surface with nowhere left to hide. The racism had been exposed, and this time no one had the courage to cover it back up. I pushed my chair farther out. The legs scraped the floor with a long, final note. No one stood to see me off. No one tried to stop me. They just watched, statues locked in their moment of defeat. I walked out, each footfall thudding down the hall like a drumbeat of presence. Behind me, the door closed and sealed in the leftover quiet, leaving it there like a verdict hanging over the men who'd just unmasked themselves. Outside, light poured through the expanse of glass blazing across the marble floor. I drew a deep breath. I didn't need applause. I didn't need recognition. I knew what had happened. I hadn't climbed another rung. They'd slipped off the ladder they thought they owned. Tomorrow they'll try to spin it. They'll call it a mix-up, a misunderstanding, maybe even a joke gone wrong. But in that moment, they knew, and I knew, the truth stood bare. No words big enough to cover it. I left the quiet behind like a cut etched in stone. And the question still hung in the air. How many times are we erased by prejudice, and how many times does the truth speak for itself? If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.